Hello, I'm AnnYager from Stith Funeral Home in Danville, Kentucky, and I was a 9/11 volunteer. Everyone remembers where they were the day that 9/11 happened almost 20 years ago. When 9/11 happened, I was in mortuary school in Nashville, Tennessee. I was nearing the end of mortuary school and only had a few months left. So that morning, I was preparing to take a test. I'll never forget, I'd stayed up all night long studying and walked into my apartment. The TV was still on, and moments later, they replayed the first plane hitting the towers. By the time I got dressed and got down to school, we watched the second plane hit the second tower. I had no idea what was really happening. None of us did. It was the scariest thing that had ever happened in American history for most of us that were alive, other than those who lived through Pearl Harbor. So that day, not knowing what to do, we took a test. We moved forward. We got evacuated from downtown Nashville later on in the day. We went and gave blood because we didn't know. We had no idea if people were surviving or not in New York and in Pennsylvania. So then weeks later, a call came out from the National Funeral Directors Association for volunteers. Even though I was still in school, I signed up. I don't know what I thought, that I would leave school and go and volunteer, but I guess I did. But I didn't get a call, and I figured it was because I was young. I was 25 at the time, 26, and getting ready to turn, because I just turned 26. And our lives started to get back to normal around November and December of 2001. But then in the spring of 2002, I got a call from the National Funeral Directors Association asking if I would still be a volunteer, if I was still willing to come to New York and work at the NYCOCME, which is the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. And I said, yes, of course. And then I had to look at my mother, because I had just moved home, started working in our family funeral home, and say, can I go to New York and work? Can I go volunteer? Can I go do this? I was getting ready to sign up for my funeral director's apprenticeship, which is a year-long apprenticeship. And she said, yes, you can go. So I did. I said, yes, I'll come. I had to do a background check and fill out lots of paperwork, and they flew me up to New York, and I stayed at a little inn about 2 blocks away from the medical examiner's office in New York City. And my job, I was a family liaison for the NYCOCME, and I was an NFDA volunteer. So each day, what I learned was my job was to meet with families. So the first 48 hours I was in New York, number one, they didn't know what to do with a girl coming from Kentucky. That was the first thing that happened. It was very funny because they thought that I wouldn't be wearing shoes, because that was what they had been told about people in Kentucky. So they weren't expecting a girl that showed up in shoes and a suit, because that's what I do. I'm a funeral director, and I generally wear suit clothes, dress clothes. And so I was told that I would be escorting families to what was called Memorial Park. Memorial Park was called a temporary permanent, that's negates itself, but it was a temporary permanent structure and had 16 refrigerated trailers in it. And in those 16 refrigerated trailers, all the remains of 9/11 were housed. And those trailers, for some families, it was the closest they would ever get to their loved one, because some people were never identified. So you have to remember how it was an amazing place. There was a flag that hung in the middle of the room that was 16 feet long. It was huge. And it was a very somber place. And 3 hours a day, anthropology shut down. Anthropology was the group that came in who was constantly working on the DNA and identifying all of the remains at the NYCOCME, at the medical examiner's office. And 3 hours a day, morning, noon, and evening, they shut down for an hour so that I could bring families. So each day, families made appointments to come to the medical examiner's office. If it was their first time, they were scared. They didn't know what they were going to see. They were scared of seeing bits and pieces of their loved one. They were trepidatious. They were sad. They were heartbroken. The very first family I met with was a father and a daughter, and this brought it home to me and showed me that it could have been any of us that lost our loved one that day. because the girl looked at me and she said, "It's my little sister Sarah. She was a flight attendant on the first plane that hit. And my little sister's name is Sarah. So it could have been my little sister on that plane." And they were so funny because they were from Arkansas, and they said, "You're the first person we can understand in Kentucky, in New York." And I said, "That's because I'm from Kentucky." And so we bonded immediately over our accents, or lack of New York accents. And for them, when we went to Memorial Park, and I walked them through, and they could see all of the 16. There were 8 on each side, this huge flag hanging in the middle. When I walked them through there, they picked one trailer because of the numbers that were on it and what the trailer said. They decided that if her remains were there, that they were in that trailer. Her remains, I don't know if they were ever identified. They were not identified while I was there. And because she was a stewardess on one of the flight, there may not be anything left of her. So she's just one of the many victims of 9/11 that I got to know their story, and I learned who they were. And that happened every day, multiple times a day. Everything from the families I met with. My other job was to work the DNA hotline to answer questions, or if families came in to take DNA samples, to hopefully have something identified of their loved ones. They also sent in toothbrushes and hairbrushes, anything that might contain someone's DNA. The hotline was specifically for families to call who had questions about if their loved one had been identified, where we were in the process, about being released. Every family had a choice of every time something was identified, because some people, there were multiple pieces of them because of the destruction of the towers. I was offered a job at the end of my stint, or towards the end of my stint. They asked me to stay and continue to work with families, and I had to make the hardest decision of my life, to stay in New York or to come home to Kentucky and finish my funeral director's license, because I was in the middle of my apprentice, just started my apprenticeship. And I made the decision to come home to Kentucky and finish my apprenticeship versus stay in New York. I've always wondered what that might have been like. But I will never, ever forget the families that I worked with, the people that I met, the stories that I heard. I got to know some of those that we lost that day. A young man who was engaged to be married. He was supposed to be married that weekend. I met his parents who live in Florida, his fiance. A father of 3 whose wife came every couple of days to visit because they lived in Jersey, and she just needed to be near her husband. So I encourage you, for the 20th anniversary, to look at the people that we lost, both in New York and in Pennsylvania. Look at the lives that we lost. Remember them. Read through their names. It was the greatest tragedy in my lifetime, I hope. And I hope we never have anything like that happen again. And it's something that will forever remain in my heart. It's just a piece of me now. So, I hope you all remember. I hope you understand. I hope this brought a little clarity to what 9/11 was for some of those of us in Kentucky who helped out. There were others. I've met other volunteers and spent some time with them, because it's kind of a strange thing when you go volunteer. You also leave a piece of yourself there. You give your emotional energy away. So that was also a learning lesson for me as a funeral director and as a person, about how much I was going to give and receive at the same time. So I encourage you again to remember those that we lost that day, those that died. Say a prayer for their families. And just be observant, please, always, of 9/11.